everything's changed. We know a lot more now than we did before, but sometimes with that awareness, that knowledge, it makes things harder to say yes to. So we spend more time on each deal. We really get to know the founders on each deal. We really try to show value over time on each deal, either whether it's through building and welcoming these founders into our networks and making the introductions at the VC and CEO mixers, or running a mastermind group for our founders, which we just did today. So really trying to do all the things that everybody's always done, which is be of a high value investor. I think we really try to put our efforts into real material things though, and measure ourselves more critically on our impact on the startups.
So welcome back to High Touch. I'm Jake.
And I'm Duffy, and this is the show where we explore how cannabis brands are designing experiences and pushing the hospitality industry forward.
We're talking guest journeys, loyalty tech, dispensaries as cultural spaces, all that stuff that makes cannabis feel more than just weed on shelves. We're talking guest journeys, loyalty tech, dispensaries as cultural spaces, all the stuff that makes cannabis feel like more than just weed on shelves.
That's right, and today's guest, this one hits close to home.
He was the first person to write us a check when Sparkplug was just a pitch deck and a lot of caffeine.
And he backed us again many years later. He's been along for the ride this whole journey with Sparkplug.
Today, we're talking with Patrick Rea. He's the co-founder of Canopy Boulder and now the managing director at the Poseidon Garden Fund.
He has seen more cannabis startups than just about anyone. It's probably invested in more cannabis businesses than just about anybody. So we'll get into how he spots founder magic, what early stage investing looks like done right, and why community might be the real capital, particularly as it pertains to the cannabis industry.
Now he's at Poseidon, where Patrick manages a $50 million fund focused on post-seed growth and works with some of the sharpest early stage and growth stage founders in the space.
He's also just one of the clearest thinkers we know when it comes to what makes a good founder actually good, and he's a great guy, so we're happy to have him here. Patrick, welcome to High Touch.
Thanks, guys. I'm glad to be here. I'm honored, actually. This is really exciting. So let's go.
Yeah, it's exciting for us as well. So I want to rewind a bit to your origin story. It's something that you've told us a lot about, but I think is a super interesting entree into the cannabis industry. You started off in natural products, in supplements, wellness, functional foods. So I'm interested to hear kind of about what made you look at cannabis and think that, yeah, this is the next frontier. This is where you wanted to kind of pivot your career.
Well, I like to think that my career in cannabis starts with an impromptu meeting of two Harvard grads on the rooftop of a law firm in Boulder, Colorado. But I'll go back a little bit further. Yeah, I was in the natural products industry for about 15 years, and I was focused on sort of business intelligence. I worked for a venture fund. I worked for an events business, a market research firm, and we worked with big and small companies through the 90s and into the 2000s. And it was a really great experience because starting in 1994, there was a change in the regulations for dietary supplements on the federal level, and that unlocked an emerging market that had been fledgling and turned it into something really big. And when cannabis was happening in my backyard here in Boulder, Colorado in 2013, it started to feel very familiar. And I think, that's when I decided to dive into it a little bit more deeply. And there was like another sort of happenstance meeting with a CEO who used to work in the supplement industry. And he sort of encouraged me to dig a little deeper. And that was the beginning. Here I am today.
Nice. Was there anything that you saw in Boulder in like consumers and some of those early dispensaries that kind of helped you chart that path from natural foods? Anything in the kind of, the type of purchaser that you were seeing maybe?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have my own personal experience with cannabis, dealing with some health issues related to insomnia, and was lucky enough to have a friend recommend an indica to me. And I remember saying, "What's an indica?" And that really changed my life and the trajectory of my health, which was one of the things that brought me to the natural products industry in Boulder. So there's this openness to the alternatives to the mainstream. I always called them the preferred alternatives to the mainstream. It was also an emerging market. I had seen how that could draw in consumers. And in cannabis, relative to a lot of supplements, is way more efficacious. You consume it and you feel the effects right away. And that tightens a feedback loop for consumers that is just undeniable. And so I had a real strong feeling that if we could make some progress on regulations, you see more states come online, that there would be a real business here. And I think it's been proven out. We're a significant business, 30 plus billion state legal markets. Then there's as estimated 30 billion in intoxicating hemp products. So it's real by any measurement.
Yeah, absolutely. So what made you jump into the cannabis space in your particular approach? Because what's interesting, I think, about Canopy Boulder is that it was, again, one of the first accelerators in cannabis and probably one of the most prolific investment firms in cannabis in terms of total number of investments, but focused very specifically on non-plant touching. So
Right.
ancillary technology services, ancillary tools that businesses could use to ultimately become more successful as cannabis businesses. What pointed you towards that sort of cohort of companies?
Yeah. I mean, we had a great template that was born in Boulder, Colorado called TechStars. It was an accelerator that launched here. And, just as we were seeing another tech boom, and I went to a meetup in town here, and someone said, you should really talk to TechStars because what you're planning to do in cannabis sounds really similar to what they've done in just general tech. The accelerator model allowed us to raise a fund and deploy it into early stage startups. Often we were the first investor, like with Sparkplug. And we were able to not only put in capital, but also have a hand in how that company like hatched or launched or whatever you want to say in the early stages. And I think we all agree in those early stages, you can have a big impact on the long-term trajectory of the business. So it's a really important time. And it just seemed like a model that fit where we get a lot of the investors into a lot of different companies and diversify that early stage emerging market risk. And, I think it paid off, and I'm proud of what we accomplished.
Yeah. What were some of those early cohorts like? I
Mm.
guess like paint us a picture of, day one, cohort one, and how you found them and how they came in and what you all learned together as you first set out doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was really frontier stuff. There were a lot of ideas and a limited number of businesses, like licensed operations, on which to bounce ideas off of. So a big part of my role early on was building a community of licensed operators who needed things. And, I don't know if we could have done it anywhere other than Colorado, because Colorado is one of the first states to legalize adult use. So that's when I would argue that the cannabis industry became investable, because the market was going to be bigger. It's sort of the floodgates had opened. Everybody was realizing the sky didn't fall and there was a zombie apocalypse after we legalized in Colorado. So it became real. The world was coming to Colorado to meet this cannabis industry. And, it all just came together. We came together really well. And I think the early days were pretty crazy. I mean, we were putting together a program for an industry that was still being born, right? So there were a lot of solutions which were good ideas at the time, but didn't have customers that now are great ideas with a lot of customers. So you need that. We were probably early on a lot of things, as I would say, but I feel confident about the decisions we made and how we approached it, and very proud of what we see today in the companies out there that are still operating, doing well, like Sparkplug.
What were some things that you had to like unteach from early founders? Things that if folks came in thinking this is what it was going to be like to start a company in the cannabis industry, and you, with all of your reps, had to kind of walk people back from?
Well, I mean, early on, we were learning from one another. I think what we learned was that, because of the rules and regulations that were so onerous and still are in cannabis, many of those skill sets that come from outside the industry aren't as valuable inside the industry as they are outside. Say that there are a lot of professionals with incredible resumes that come into cannabis, and they walk in the door of the cannabis industry. They look down at their tool belt, and they're missing the drill and the hammer, and they're like, what do I do? So there's a lot of really strong, smart professionals that have been come up in the industry that I think contribute more to startups now than folks that come from the outside.
So you've seen hundreds of pitches at this point, decks and presentations. What are some green flags that you kind of like learned to spot, or some of that pattern recognition that just comes with the reps that you've had?
Yeah, I know I'm dealing with a sophisticated entrepreneur when they come to pitch and they ask questions. They get to know us, and not like me or like what I eat for breakfast or anything like that, but like they understand, they ask about where we are in our fund cycle. How big is the fund? How's it going? How much time do we have left to deploy? When does the fund end and we have to return money back to the investors? What's our preferred terms and approaches? So that's a signal. That's a strong signal. And I'd encourage all entrepreneurs to, ask questions first before launching into a pitch, especially if you plan to raise equity and you find out you're talking to an investor who only does debt. You know, it's a nice meet. No reason to go any further, right?
Yeah.
So that's probably the biggest one.
Any red flags?
Founders who don't check in on like after the first couple of slides, but they are just a cross-eyed stream of consciousness until they finish. And then, the other red flag, it's not really a red flag, but it's so easy to end a presentation by saying thank you so that everybody knows you're done. Uncomfortable silence at the end of a pitch
I feel like,
is really
in our
telling
time in
of awareness.
Canopy, I feel like, in our time in Canopy, obviously such a big aspect of it was the IRL pitch, the
Mhm.
pitch to an audience or to an individual or a group of individuals. And I think that's kind of a lost art. You don't really see that being the norm anymore. It's maybe a pitch on Zoom or a memo or a conversation, but that kind of classic pitch model I don't think is there. And while I appreciate that some of the barriers to entry for fundraising have therefore been lowered around, who happens to be a charismatic public speaker, which, may or may not correlate with actually being a successful founder or entrepreneur. I do think that there's a lot that you learn in having to present to people and see how they react in the moment and where their eyes glaze over versus where they're kind of sitting up a little bit versus what questions they ask versus how your demeanor and your way of approaching the problem and the question, resonates with them or doesn't.
I would agree. It's a lost art. I mean, and let's just be clear, you are one of the best out there. But it makes sense that you don't understand why people can't do it, maybe, but it is true. COVID really changed things for investing and entrepreneurship, and many ways is a real positive, and some ways is a real negative too. I think investors are drawn to intelligent, charismatic, clear communicators, because if you're building anything with a team, you need to be all of those. And you need to be able to move through friction, get through challenges, as well as inspire people. And that's many times what you're doing in a pitch. It's like a microcosm, a micro event that sort of sheds light into how you'll approach the business. It's not the only thing that matters by no stretch of the imagination. I think we all know that. But in that first meeting, it is key to demonstrate mastery of what are some of the basic skills required for entrepreneurship.
It also feels like a good signal of, I don't want to say explicitly intelligence, but prioritization. When we interview a candidate and we ask them a question and they're able to say, here's the most important answer to that question. Here's the most important thing. Yeah, sure, I could list 10 things, but I know that this is the most important one. It actually reflects the fact that it's really easy to say, here are the 10 things that you should do to have a successful company. It's really hard to say, what's the one thing I need to do to have a successful company? Because you've got 9 other ones to choose from that all sound pretty interesting. So I think that's a really good point there, Patrick.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think could be interesting to just give our audience a little bit of exposure to the ArcView group. That was an investment association which you and Canopy had a great relationship with for several years, and I think still operates today, right? Tell us a little bit about the ArcView group and that community, because I think of you always as someone who is at the epicenter of people and operators and businesses in this industry and making those connections. And ArcView is very much that, kind of like one of the first institutions to formalize a commitment to that
Yeah.
ethos for the industry. And I do want to get into in a little bit some of the work that you're doing now on community building, but maybe like chart us a brief history on ArcView and what it was and what it became and how it kind of paced the industry, to where it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the birth of any industry, you need to have touch points for people to come together and for the tribe to gather. And ArcView provided that for the investment community in the early stages, and they're very successful at what they did. Whereas you had like MJ BizCon and MJ Biz Daily rising and playing a role in terms of sharing content and providing sort of a trade show experience. ArcView was really the investor forum. And when I started Canopy Boulder, a business accelerator, my experience in the natural products industry was that partnering up with the investor forum and or creating one was critical to making the connections between entrepreneurs and the investors and having deals and investment happen. So when I joined and partnered up with ArcView really early, they asked me to be a mentor to some of the companies. Those companies were successful in winning the pitch competitions. So they actually reached out and said, "Hey, we're thinking about starting a business accelerator." And I had the presentation, the pitch deck for Canopy Boulder, and pushed it across the table and said, "Well, we were looking for an investor forum partner." And so it was sort of like that kismet, like the moment where it all made sense. And so we partnered. COVID did some serious damage on the event space, as we all know, and very few events had the capital and to make it through. ArcView was one of those that really struggled because of such an emerging market, and cannabis rose and then fell and the public stocks collapsed. And it's been really hard, I think, on that business model, especially as also we haven't seen the exits that generate that and that the exits that I think everybody expected, the federal legalization driven exits. So a lot of the investment community in cannabis has sort of taken a pause. They haven't left. They still have portfolios, but they are just changed how they're engaging with the industry. So nowadays, ArcView does a lot of consulting and does host some events. In that void of events, I really try to continue on. And even at Canopy, we would do a lot of events. I'm sure you guys remember a lot of those good times of trying to bring more people in to sort of build your networks and build all the startups networks. So yeah, now I put together 6, 7 VC and CEO mixers every year at different events and really lean in and helping our companies have the right connections and giving them a leg up against competition through the network.
Yeah, for all those reasons you kind of just hit on, continued prohibition and COVID, it seems like the industry maybe has not panned out how you and some of those kind of earliest pioneers 10 years ago thought it would necessarily.
Yeah.
What reasons do we have today to continue to be optimistic about the trajectory of this space? And yeah, what keeps you, I guess, kind of still showing up every day?
Yeah, I mean, so much has changed. And when I started on this journey with my partners and other investors back in 2013, 14, we all thought federal legalization was just around the corner. It was like the first 3 to 5 years. So, that didn't materialize, but the industry's still grown significantly. And I think what keeps me going is seeing the success of some of the companies to be able to get to cash flow positivity if they're technology companies and control their future, or to see the licensed operators and know that it can be done, right? You can build up a business that generates cash flow. And yes, the investment thesis has changed over the years, not surprisingly in an emerging market, which is going to zig and zag its way up and to the right. I think in emerging markets, investors need to be responsive to the changes out there and adjust their investment criteria and strategy accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple of years ago, maybe 2020, 2021, moved on from Canopy and stepped into this role at Poseidon. And, if Canopy is characterized as pre-seed and series seed, then Poseidon sits more in that kind of post-seed, series A, maybe series B, more growth capital. I guess, what does that evolution look like for you as an investor, and how you evaluate deals and what you're looking for? And has it kind of been a natural graduation for you, or have you kind of had to really kind of change your evaluation criteria, of course, naturally, but, just the way that you look at deals and engage with some of these prospects?
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Everything's changed. Everything's changed. I went from pre-revenue startups in technology, two guys, a pitch deck, and a lot of chutzpah, right? Now we're looking at, backing dispensaries, border stores on the edges of weed deserts where we can do FOIA requests and pull records from the state to understand what the competitive landscape looks like, locally and regionally. Um, and now there's so many more things that have become clearly the right thing to do and clearly the wrong thing to do. So it's like, it's been such an interesting evolution in sort of investment strategies. The stuff that we're doing today, we never could have done 10 years ago. And we started because the market was just so frothy and there was so much money flowing in. The terms that we drive or get today wouldn't work. In addition, we've solved some of the problems of getting social equity stores, as that's where our focus is, mostly on retail. We figured out how to navigate the regulations and work with the sort of state bodies to get our investments approved and still, reasonably underwrite a great return for our investors. So everything's changed. We know a lot more now than we did before, but sometimes with that awareness, that knowledge, it makes things harder to say yes to. So we spend more time on each deal. We really get to know the founders on each deal. We really try to show value over time on each deal, either whether it's through building and welcoming these founders into our networks and making the introductions at the VC and CEO mixers, or running a mastermind, mastermind group for our founders, which we just did today. So I'm really trying to do all the things that everybody's always done, which is be of a high value investor. I think we really try to put our efforts into real material things, though, and measure ourselves more critically on our impact on the startups.
Patrick, I'll pivot a little bit because I'm curious, based on your experience seeing natural products evolve through a regulatory change, basically from, not zero, but basically zero to huge global industry, where do you feel like we're at in that progression with cannabis?
Oh.
Are we ready to get more into that classic lifestyle branding? Are we still working on consumer trust? Where do you think we are in terms of the development of the industry, and what do you think is the big next step to continue to mature?
Yeah, I think in 1994, when the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was passed, you saw this coming. It was pretty clear. Things moved slower. They were, sending faxes and they were doing letter writing campaigns. So it was pretty clear what was going to happen. And I think that gave time for a lot of folks to get on board. And everything sort of passed more smoothly through, even though there was some hiccups near the end of it when it was passed through the Senate. But that's an interesting history lesson that doesn't necessarily apply to today. Things happen so fast. People often ask me, like, well, when are you expecting federal legalization to happen? And I say Friday at 5 p.m. Because like when anything happens that is like sort of contentious or needs to happen, like there needs to be a lot of deals, usually it's going to happen, at the last minute. But there are conversations being had in DC. New angles are going to be being played. Everyone's realized now you got to have a congressional approach, an approach that is going after laws in the judicial branch, and that is also, going after the executive branch. So, in 2014, they were just trying to get the state laws changed, and like federal legalization was something people were working on, but you weren't getting any meetings. Now we're in the room, the conversations are being had. We're so much closer. world has a lot of problems right now that is diverting a lot of attention from cannabis reform, but it's right there. It's all ready to ready to go. You just have to get a few people to change their views. And I think then we'll see a bit of a cascading of events quickly that will change things.
Yeah,
When
what
that
does
happens, like I said, Friday at
Yeah,
5
right
p.m.,
before the
but I don't
midterms.
know what month or year.
what does change, when that happens and when it's,
Well,
rescheduling seems like the most realistic kind of next domino to fall, let alone federal legalization. People kind of use those terms interchangeably, but they mean very different things. And obviously,
Mhm.
under the Biden administration, the DEA was meant to reschedule or deschedule cannabis to Schedule 3, which would have its own host of implications. But, as the industry is clearly orienting around these kind of federal events and boundary conditions, how do you factor that into like an investment thesis, and what does it actually mean for operators?
Yeah, I think I have really clear thoughts on this. I think that every entrepreneur in cannabis and every investor in cannabis should underwrite the status quo. We have a
Mm,
pretty stable foundation for the state legal cannabis business. And the bigger that the state programs grow, the more gravitational force and weight that they carry relative to any other federal change. And I think that what would happen on the federal level to act as the catalyst, there's a number of things, and I think you mentioned a lot of them, Jake. Rescheduling, descheduling, federal legalization, banking reform. There are so many things. Like, I'd love to see stablecoin legislation be enacted that could provide a backbone for on which the industry could circumvent the traditional bank rails. Like,
mm.
any of these moves could act as a significant catalyst for the industry to get mainstream companies to buy into cannabis or to have new investors feel comfortable and unlock their capital to deploy into the cannabis industry. I think there's no like probably one thing that happens, but it needs to be a series of events and it come a long way. I think there's still a lot to be done, but it's an emerging market. We'll see some change on the federal level at some point, and when that happens, everybody just has to be ready and planning for it because it's going to move fast. And that's one thing I learned from the natural products industry was that when things started to happen, they happened fast, and the people that were ready for it won. Those that had to scramble and like build a team and figure out a thesis for why they were a good acquisition or why they should be the consolidator. The sort of grand catalytic event and the benefits of it didn't last forever. And there was a moment or a period of time where they could jump and consolidate, and it was really fruitful for them.
So, in the interest of, getting one's ducks in order in preparation of that sort of event, what should operators be doing and preparing for now? Say, descheduling is on the horizon. How do we as an ancillary company prep for that? Or how do some of these state-based operators or even MSOs really position themselves to be, in a position to take advantage of those changes?
Well, you got to be thinking about it. You got to have the conversations. You've got to prepare your sort of base, your investors, your team. You can't shy away from the conversations just because you don't know the answer to the question, right? But like I was talking to another founder today, and he had this change on the horizon when this challenge he knew that was coming down the pipe. And he's like, "Well, what do I do?" And I was like, "Communicate, talk about it, socialize the problem and what your thoughts are of the solution. You know, like get it on paper, have a call about it, bring people together. Don't be afraid to talk about this problem that sits out ahead of you because it's coming. You know it's coming, and you might learn something, or at least you build consensus in the strategy that you want to pursue so that when it happens, it's not like I have to introduce the problem to all these stakeholders to get them to buy in. We already talked about it. And it's like, okay, everybody, let's go, and it makes it easier for people to say yes to whatever the resources you're going to need when it happens.
One quick follow up on that. I'm curious, as an investor, what does mentorship look like for you? I think as a
Mm.
founder, it's kind of obvious who your mentors might be, your investors or maybe founders that are further ahead. They're at the next series or the next series, or they've sold their company. When you're an investor looking for that kind of mentorship and advice, where does that come from? Where do you turn?
I am maybe old enough to know I don't have all the answers. I worked so hard to build the network so that when the founders have a question that I can't answer, don't feel comfortable, or honestly, I shouldn't, because it's not an area of my expertise, that I have someone that I can pass them along, and that person will be responsive. Now, it's a little harder to keep that network fresh when you're running an accelerator and you got 10 to 12 businesses every 6 months that need advice and guidance. But one of the things I really like about Poseidon is that we've invested in a certain number of companies in this fund. It's not, not 100. And it's enough companies to work with individually and have regular conversations so you can stay on top of the problems that they're dealing with to help them find solutions. Today in our New Jersey retailer mastermind call, we had the founder of Butter Cannabis, Patrick Rea, who's up in Connecticut, come on and talk to the founders of these 5 stores that we've invested in New Jersey. And it was gold. It was so good. We focused on the 4 critical things: inventory management, staffing, customer acquisition, customer retention, the things that like make a dispensary run forward beyond location and your lease terms, right? And it was gold. Those notes are going to be things I'll reach back and review in the future. And, so having those relationships is key, because it's not, we can't
Well, you've got to
have,
have a lot of
I
them.
can't be the mentor that has every answer. It's impossible.
Well, you've got to have a lot of them. So I respect the humility and I really appreciate that mindset. So I guess maybe a quick pivot here. I'm kind of curious, I guess in cannabis as well as more generally, now that we're in what feels like a new era of technology associated with AI, what are the types of founders that you think are poised to be the most successful? Maybe in the past it was the super technical guy with the super salesy guy or gal, and that really resulted in that kind of chocolate and peanut
Right.
butter outcome. What is it now? Is it design? Is it hacking? Is it, sales acumen? What do you think really is going to be successful in the next maybe couple years for founders?
Well, I mean, I think it's still a lot of the same things. You need a balanced team. You need a team that works together well. They have good rapport and honesty with one another. I think with cannabis, it used to be that we didn't know. We really didn't know. It was like, I think this will be a good tool, or I think this is going to be a problem that needs solved. Now we know. So I think the founders who have started the journey already of understanding and finding, I don't know, like some people call it technical empathy, like you're finding and understanding the problems that are in the market. You've seen it firsthand and you understand it's an acute pain point that people will pay for to go away. So, I mean, that and, an awareness of there's room for this startup, or you're going to do something truly different that will take market share. Are you going to eat someone else's lunch? Or are you going to create a whole new, diet? And you understand the history of the startups. I mean, very often we get pitches from founders who clearly don't understand what they're talking about because they're not aware of the competitors or the rules or the regulations, and you still want to help those people, and we do, but you just can't spend too much time on that.
Any space that you feel is underbuilt or what those white space opportunities are, I think, AI can kind of fit squarely in that. But, piggybacking on that, is there anything that you just feel is just so saturated, whether that is ancillary or touching the plant, any brand positioning or, tech tools or dispensary ethos that you just feel is overdone and there's not enough room for anymore?
Yeah, I mean, we've been spending a lot of time at Poseidon thinking about the next 15 years in cannabis. And we've been building a thesis on what that looks like and how we should approach it. Certainly, I think there's so much we've learned in the last 10 years about how to run a store well, or what you should expect from a new cultivation, or what the arc of pricing will be in these independent state markets as they turn on, go through high growth period, and then, move into a more mature phase. What's clear? I think the future of cannabis is brands. If that's not today, that's tomorrow. And there are people building for brands tomorrow and building brands today, but brands are expensive. They've got to be run efficiently. A lot of the history of brands is brands being built for throwing money at a problem or an opportunity. In cannabis, there's not as much investment dollars, so you have to do it more efficiently. So the market is forcing an evolution that I think everybody's trying to understand. But right now, the cash flow that can be generated from licensed operators at the right points in those different state markets evolution is key. That's what we try to focus on. And I think absent some change on the federal level, every founder should be driving towards a profitable business that controls its own destiny and balancing the opportunities in the market with maintaining that control of their future. I'm an investor, so I look at everything as an investment. When will I get a return? What capital is needed? What's competitive landscape, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as founders, I think, that shift from more of like an exit focus, let's build it and sell it, to more of an operational focus has been a welcome change from my perspective in the industry. And I think that will put us on a more sustainable path into the future.
Well said. We'll do some quick rapid fire questions to close us out here.
Okay.
Jake, take it away.
All right. So fill in the blank. The cannabis startup of the future will be
AI driven.
What is one belief about cannabis investing that you've changed your mind about over the course of your career?
Yeah. I'm looking for founders who want to be good businesses, not just build to sell.
Okay.
one founder or company that deserves more attention.
And you can't say Sparkplug.
There are a number of founders out there that are working to put these, integrate artificial intelligence tools into their software platforms that, again, make the user the sort of hero in the story. That really compels me because working with the licensed operators, I know how overloaded they are on, hiring and operating and dealing with regulations. Like, if you can have somewhat of an artificial intelligence oriented solution set provided to those founders on the big expenses and revenue drivers of their business, so they can get out of the forest that they're in and see the trees, or whatever it is, that is really powerful. And I think that will be the next evolution of successful businesses in cannabis.
Love it. Well said. And then last one here. What is the best or worst investment decision that you've made in your time in the cannabis industry?
I think best investment decision was to start pivoting and focusing and building an investment approach to invest in licensed operators, specifically dispensaries, and doing things that people didn't understand and no one had done before, where, we had to spend a ton of time talking to founders to help them understand, talking to their lawyers to help them understand, talking to regulators to help them understand. I think that was a good decision. And, I think also sort of leaning into the AI tools and the tool set that are out there to save on legal expense, to better understand giant contracts and leases and investment documents. Like, the amount of time and energy that we've saved utilizing those tools has been immense. And I think I'm super excited for when I hear that our founders are doing the same. And I know is a game changer for everyone. I hope you hear in my comments that I do believe that even in cannabis, there are immense opportunities in using those tools to make things more efficient.
Well said, and a great speed round. Everybody, Patrick Rea is the managing director at Poseidon and co-founder of Canopy Boulder. He started in the natural products world, where he learned how trust and functionality for the customer shape an emerging market. He brought that lens to cannabis, where, as we've said, he co-founded one of the first startup accelerators in the space and helped over 100 companies, including Sparkplug, find their footing. Patrick's not just an investor. He's one of the people who has built the early stage cannabis ecosystem from its infancy. We're so lucky to keep learning from him. Thank you so much for joining us, Patrick.
Thanks for having me, guys. Great to see you.